Hi, welcome to my latest YouTube channel and podcast. I am Ross Rosenberg. I'm excited and very curious to have a friend and a colleague, Karen McMahon, join us in a discussion about what she does and how valuable it is to the world of codependence or people who suffer from what I call self-love deficit disorder. But before I proceed, Karen, would you be so kind to introduce yourself and tell the viewers and listeners a little bit about yourself?
Hey, Russ, thanks so much for having me on your show. And it's always a pleasure when you and I get together and talk about this. So my name's Karen McMahon. I'm the founder of Journey Beyond Divorce. We've been helping men and women through the before, during, and after stages of high conflict divorce for about 14 years. And my passion is to really help individuals who emerge from these difficult divorces feeling diminished, broken, scared, uncertain, and guiding them through the process, both the inner process and the legal process, so that they emerge feeling healthy, whole, and really excited about the next chapter of their life. And that, in a nutshell, is what we do.
Trust me, guys, when you get a chance to check her website out and the program she offers, she's a lot more than that. But I know Karen, we know each other, and it probably goes back, it's about 8 years. Is it that long, Karen?
I was
10 years?
thinking we met when you first came on my podcast. So I think
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
somewhere around 7, 8 years ago.
Yes. And you've invited me on many of those, and those have always been interesting. And today, I get you to be on mine. And the reason I anticipate a great discussion and excited about it is I know the people that I work with have benefited greatly from your services. I've referred people to you, and you and your work and how you do it, which we're going to learn about, does not interfere with the psychotherapy or the treatment element of what I've created, my self-love recovery program. But can you talk first about the typical type of person or the typical situation of that person that could most benefit from the services you offer?
Yeah. I got into this field because I was in a very high conflict marriage, a divorce that
Hmm.
took 2.5 years with a spouse that I believe is on the narcissistic spectrum. And so many of the people who come to us have a lot of the similar struggles that I had. And so uh, they're they've just been for years or decades in a marriage that has diminished them in a nutshell, blaming, berating, criticizing, all of these things. And so here you're about to enter divorce, which is so scary, even when you're leaving a quasi healthy marriage, and
Hmm.
yet you're so diminished. And so our individual is someone who knows they're scared, knows they want to do it, but they're afraid to do it, doesn't understand the process. And here's the key: most of what's going on between their ears is what their spouse is saying. Like they've almost lost agency in their own mind. And so he or she is threatening this about money and that about the children, and I'm going to be on the street. And so they're coming with this added fear, but also this added obstacle of somebody else running their mind, their mental space. And so we really work with them to first notice their own thought behavior and their emotional situation so that they can develop some strength to move forward. I leave the diagnosing to people like you who have the license and ability to do
Yeah.
it. So I do talk about difficult personalities, high conflict divorce. And I also encourage my clients not to put labels that doesn't serve them when they go to speak to their attorney or the judge. Talk
Yes.
about the behavior and the propensity. Do not put on your junior psychologist cap and label, because you diminish yourself when you start diagnosing your spouse. But when you talk about what you've experienced, that's a whole different ballgame. And the truth is, I've worked with people whose spouse is on the autistic spectrum, they're bipolar, they're borderline personality.
Mhm.
We're lay people. We don't know. All we know is they're difficult. They're black and white.
Yeah.
They have propensities. Let's talk about the propensities. The second thing I encourage
Mhm.
people to do is stop focusing on how he or she shows up, because you have no power on their side of the street. So, yes, your spouse may behave in all of these displeasing ways, and it might seem like they are 99% of the problem. But the truth is, divorce, the divorce process, there's so much that's outside of our control. Right. We can't control how our attorney shows up, how our spouse shows up, how quick or slow the court goes. Like, there's so much we can't control. And people always like, how do I feel empowered? And it's such a simple answer. You're going to feel empowered when you keep all of your focus on you. So your soon-to-be ex does this thing that triggers you. Rather than focusing on what they do and why it's wrong and how they're bad and how many times it happened, you shift to, wow, how does that feel? And how do I react to it? And what's the story I create around it? And do I shrink away because I'm conflict averse, or do I blow up and fight because I tend to explode? And in that space, when we start talking about the many different small interactions that happen, our clients begin to notice, wow, I do bring tendencies to the table, and they do end up being in that codependent self-love deficit category. I am a people pleaser. I am afraid of what he says. I do say or do things just so that she'll, not be mad at me. And so when they begin to focus on their behavior, when I think about my divorce, all I think about is that I've been told I'm not going to have the kids, I'm going to lose the money, the house isn't mine. And so when we can slow that down and start poking around at, well, how true are these stories? And are you, and this is a big one, are you listening to what your spouse says rather than what your attorney says? Help me to understand why. These are the things that really open people's hearts and minds to the fact that, okay, I'm letting in new people, and this crazy, chaotic life I've been in is having some light shined on it. And I'm expanding my perspective, and I'm starting to see things differently.
What is the best way to calm them down and move them incrementally into your program of help, guidance, instruction, and etc. and more?
On a very kind of broad stroke level, that first step is inviting them into a new awareness, right? Just changing the vantage point enough so that they're looking in the mirror. And then the next thing is acceptance. One of the things, Ross, that I've heard 100 times is, my husband did X, and I can't believe he did it. And I'll say, has he ever done it before? 1,000,000 times.
Yeah.
And I think you call it delusion. I remember you saying that and me going, oh, wow, that makes so much sense. So like this, it's almost like it's a lack of acceptance. So it's like, of course you can believe it. He's done it 1,000,000 times over 20 years, but you're not accepting that he has unacceptable behavior. If you're not going to accept it, if you're always going to be in the I can't believe place, you have no access to choice. It's only when you stepped into, this is something he or she does all the time. What do I want to do differently? And here's the key. How can I be expecting and accepting of how my soon-to-be ex shows up? Until I can be expecting and accepting, I get triggered, I go into fight, flight. But once I'm accepting and expecting, it's more like, of course, there she goes again. And I've given this some thought while I was in my rational mind. So now I have some strategies for how I'm going to handle it. It begins to completely turn their interaction with their soon-to-be ex around.
Reminds me of something I wrote in my first book called Roller Coaster Addiction. There's this almost excitement of the intensity and the anxiety and the fear of the roller coaster. And then once you're riding on it, you promise yourself you'll never do this again. Never, never, never. And you pray, if I can just make it, I'll never do it again. And then once you get off it and you're no longer dizzy or sick, an hour later, you start to think of it as, well, that was kind of fun. Analogously speaking, the SLDs, or the codependents, they are so used to what they think is the strength that they have in these fights and these ups and downs, and they find comfort in that high conflict environment. But what they don't realize is they have no control and power over it. And when given an opportunity to step away from it, for some reason, and they don't usually know this, they're going to get in line again for the next roller coaster.
Yeah.
And a person like you has to teach them why you must slow down, step away, and maybe think other ways of managing the problem than getting right in the middle of all the conflict all the time.
You know, Ross, I think
Mhm.
that, you talk about this, right? So none of us, I've used this term with you before, lick it off the grass. None of us, we don't do this just because. We do it because of how we were raised. And so,
Yeah.
to your point, talk about familiar. If I've been raised in chaos and conflict, and then I
Yeah.
marry into chaos and conflict, is it comfortable? No, I'll tell you it's utterly uncomfortable, but it's so familiar that when I step away from it, that's awkward. And
Right.
I move back to what's comfortable, right? And so you get caught in it. I had a client, he called me maybe six months to a year after the divorce was final. And he said, I'm embarrassed to say this, but I have this feeling like my life is more boring now.
Is more what? Did you say
Boring.
boring? Oh,
Boring. And what it
yeah.
turned out was that he was detoxing from the chaos and the conflict. And we talked about holding his
Mhm.
boundaries. And then he reached out to me like another month or two later, and he's like, oh my God, boring's awesome. You know,
Right.
because he had gotten to that point where he like really detached from it. And I think addiction is one of the terms that fits.
I'm glad you brought that up because the way that I conceptualize SLDD and codependency is it is an addiction. And it'll suffice to say that it has all those properties and enticing people to think that they can control it, have fun, and the excitement, euphoria is always going to be there. But like other addictions, you never can control it. The consequences are always too big. And despite all the promises that you make to yourself that you will never do it again, you break them.
And if I could give a tangible example, one of the big conversations I have with clients is how do you tell the children? And this is
Well,
a
we
place
we
where,
might disagree on this one, but let's see where it goes.
yeah. So
It'll be
so
interesting.
so the standard rule is you tell the children together, you tell them mommy and daddy loves them,
Yeah.
and what I have found is so many of my clients, when we begin to tease this apart, I'm telling the kids with my soon to be ex because he or she wants it that way and will be mad if I don't. And here's what I say. What's best for the children? And so I'll just share my own personal example. I
Hmm.
decided to tell my 4 and 6-year-old separately because
Right.
I knew that daddy was going to be catastrophic, that he was going to throw me under the bus,
Right.
that it was going to be such a scary, overwhelming experience for them. And so I knew that was going to happen either way. But if I could explain to them, mommy's made the decision, this is what I'm doing, we want to have less fighting. And daddy's upset and he's going to talk to you, but it's going to be okay. And kind of pouring a solid foundation. Then, when they have that first, and then they hear from the high conflict person, you've given them a container or the beginning of a container so that they at least have two narratives going on. If you
Right.
do it together and you're quickly tossed under the bus. You and the kids kind of go down the toilet together, and that
Right.
other parent is the only one who feels good about it.
Right. And add that if you do it together, the kids watch the subtle, either direct or indirect manipulation in silencing or belittling or or um, or manipulation of the other spouse. So
So do you agree with me?
actually I do. I was ready to say, because there's this camp, the traditional camp that will say, always say it together, never say anything negative about the other person. And I will say that is true and important, and I stand by that when we are dealing with two parents who, despite their differences and reasons to divorce, have the same concern for the children's mental health and say to the children what the children need to know so that they don't have to take a side. Now, that's not common with the clients you see and the clients I see,
Right.
because they are systematically beaten down, weakened, they're gaslit, their self-esteem has been crushed, and they have, because they're SLDs, they have not always behaved responsibly to their children because of their focus on getting the narcissist to do what they want or making the narcissist happy, which is, of course, impossible, because there's this belief that you should never say anything negative about the other parent. But what if that other parent has been very harmful and toxic and abusive and manipulative? And by not saying anything negative, you are accidentally affirming or even complimenting the other parent. How do you manage that situation?
Yeah, I think first of all, it gets so very complex, and I agree with you. I also think that there are times where if you have a 15-year-old and a 5-year-old, you don't tell them together. That 15-year-old deserves their own time and space to ask questions and then be there to support their 5-year-old sibling. So when it comes to what you say about the other parent, my rule is you can talk about the child's experience, you don't talk about the other parent. So daddy's not an X, Y, and Z, but like in my case, it was like, how much fighting has been happening under the roof and that we've all been stressed and there's a lot of yelling and screaming and it kind of makes everyone feel uncomfortable. And we want to do this in a way where, we'll be under one roof and it'll be one way. And then, you and your sister and daddy will be under another roof. And so there's a way of saying it where, because I think to your point, you have to validate the children's experience. If you're like, and I've had clients who are like, oh, mommy really loves you. It's like, be very careful, acknowledge and validate the child's experience without character assassinating their parent, because they're half of their parent. So they're half of them is their parent. So you want to be very careful, but the experience is so important to acknowledge and validate. Always ask more than you tell. When you ask even your child more than you tell, you get to see how they're thinking and how they're feeling. And I think
that's great. I like that.
We could take that exact conversation and say, let's say there's a conflict we're afraid of, I want to talk to you about this thing. What is your experience when, let's say, dad does X, Y, and Z, and how does that make you feel? And kind of bring all of that to the surface first. I want to share something with you, and I don't want you to be in that situation when we talk about this. And so I would share it, and then I would ask them. I would encourage my parents to then ask them, is this something you would want to tell your dad, and why? And again, so from my coaching angle of doing things, I think that 9 times out of 10, we can help our children process what's real and clear by asking them a lot of questions and then gently holding them while they find their way. At the end of the day, there are going to be things that they tell the other parent that you wish they hadn't.
Right.
And that's
Right.
going to be actually valuable information because they're going to come back and say, Daddy bit my head off.
Right.
How was that for you? What were you
Right.
talking about? If you could have done it differently, what would you have done differently? How can I support you? And so they are really invited to come to these decisions on their own with your support and guidance, as opposed to, I told you not to tell Daddy. I knew he was going to do that. Now he made you feel so. Don't
Yeah.
do that. Don't do
Yeah,
that. So hit gloves.
but you are doing to them with what I do to my client is you are affirming what they've already experienced and you are putting words to it and you are just giving them advice. And ultimately it's a risk, but the goal always is to protect the children. These discussions are should be precisely navigated with the one thought in mind is how to protect the children, not how to use the children to protect you. And and there's all sorts of ways to do the same thing. And I'm glad that you're able to think on your feet.
And I would love to just kind of on the
Yes.
that you can't protect your children until you get healthy enough to be able to have your perspective and not your spouse's perspective. And so I'll give one example. I co-parented for 10 years.
Yeah.
And Dad had 50% custody. And I got a lot of phone calls from my kids
Yeah.
when they're really scared and upset. Without me doing my work and working through all of my people-pleasing issues, my fear of conflict issues and what have you, I could not have supported them. My daughter must have been 7 or 8 one day, and she called me. It was bedtime, and she didn't want Daddy to lay down and read a book with her. And we had a little conversation about boundaries. And we talked about what she wanted to say and how it might unfold. And then she said, I can't, I'm scared. And I was able to say, well, what are you scared of? Well, he'll yell at me.
Right.
And I said to her, has he ever yelled at you before? And she's like, oh, Mommy, he yells at me all the time. Right. And so what I was able to say to her was, Dominique, I lost my voice in my marriage, and I don't ever want you to lose your voice. And sometimes we say things because it's our truth and not because we're going to impact or change the other person. So can you be brave enough to say it? And she said, and I'll call you back. My daughter is 25 years old. Nobody shuts this girl up. She speaks her mind. She has great boundaries.
Who's she like?
We can break generational chains of this kind of behavior when we work really hard at healing ourselves. And if you're going through a divorce, use the divorce. And that's why it's so important to have people like Ross who can really help with that mental health side. Yeah, I think that together, so many of my clients have this hybrid support of therapeutic support, which I do not offer. That is not my wheelhouse. And then my experience, both in the legal process and how to navigate all the complexities, as well as being a human being who's trying to do things differently after maybe a lifetime of behaviors that came from childhood.
You started off by saying you have to take care of yourself. You have to be healthy in order to take care of the children. And I remind my clients by using this simple discussion. I said, I asked them, when you were on a plane the last time, they ask you, and hopefully you pay attention, and they show you what happens if the oxygen mask should descend. And they say, put the oxygen mask on your face before putting it on the child, because you are no good to the child. And they don't say this directly, but if you become asphyxiated and pass out, and then the child, it's not good. And so I use the oxygen mask first as an example that the children need to know that you're strong enough to protect them. And between what you do and what I do, and the fact that these divorces with pathological narcissists are always high conflict and always tumultuous and sometimes dangerous, the kids need to know that mom or dad, that the person who's working with us, can take care of themselves.
Right.
And that's something that is so important with my clients because they're self-love deficient, they're codependent. They have a life history, a marital history of not protecting themselves and therefore not protecting the kids. So the very best advice you can give them is what you are saying, is take care of yourself first. And then you'll be able to much, much more fluently and effectively be able to be there for their kids in the worst times.
I think a lot of people, Ross, are like all about the divorce. And what I'm here to tell you is a piece of paper signed and stamped by the judge doesn't do jack to change your dynamic with your ex. And it's a long game. And especially if you have children, and like me, young children, once you step off the divorce battlefield, you now have years of navigating the people you brought into the world and love more than anything, and this other personality. It is vital that you understand your part, that you heal as best you can so that you can really support these children. I have people come to me 5, 8, 10 years post-divorce, and they're miserable because they got a legal divorce, but they never did the emotional healing work that they had to do so that they could be a stand for themselves and their children. And the other thing I'm going to say is first marriages have a 50% divorce rate. Second marriages have a 67% divorce rate. Third marriages have a 73% divorce rate. We're not divorcing the problem. We're part of the problem. When you take care of your part, however you choose to live post-divorce, whether you remarry or anything else, you will be much better off, as will your children and your grandchildren if you break those generational chains.
I have something to say about the first part and the second part, and then we'll probably have to wrap this one up and just wait for the next time to jump back into it. But when you were talking about how the tumult, the dysfunction, the conflict, the difficulty, it's not just the divorce, because then you have the post-divorce relationship. And if you're an SLD who's in recovery, it's not going to change the other person. And most courts don't want to make a decision between who's right and who's wrong. And the tendency for most court decisions these days are shared custody or equal custody.
And it's very heartbreaking when you feel like you can't help your kid.
Yes.
Yeah.
And for all sorts of reasons, including legal reasons, I can't go into what that heartbreak's about. But my son is 30 years old now, and I say this to all parents. I created this thought experiment 20 years ago, and it goes like this: if you have a child and you're getting a divorce and you worry about him in the future, imagine the child being 30 years old in therapy, and the therapist asking, "So what was your dad," which is me, and if you're the mom, your mom, what was your mom's impact on your life?
Great question. I love that.
And so what it does is it forces it through this exercise. It forced me to predict into the future the culmination of all the good things that I was doing that impacted my son and what he would and what he thought about it, because how he answers a therapist in this thought experiment will make you believe that this is all going to end up as good as possible because its impact will be there and he will have remembered it and been able to talk about it. So I recommend to anyone listening, if you're not sure about the impact of all the good things that you are doing, do what I do. Do the thought experiment. Imagine your child being 30 years old and the therapist asking, so tell me about your mom. And then listen to what you think that child's going to say. And it should be affirming and comforting.
And I will say that so many people are afraid, right? It's like understandable. This child of mine is going to spend half their time in this household with somebody who's, disordered. And the truth is, what facts have shown is it only takes one healthy parent to be a loving stand, regulated stand for the child to emerge healthy. And I have seen it over my 14 years over and over again, where parents don't believe it, but then they get themselves healthy and they do the work and they pay it forward to their children. And it's one of the most rewarding things to see. And I would imagine you would agree,
Yeah.
to see your adult children being healthy in their relational behavior, understanding boundaries, having good communication, clearly being a little bit further away from the chaos and conflict that we were in the marriage.
Any tips that you'd have for the listeners, the viewers?
Yes, actually, you have so many nifty little sayings. I thought I would share one of my own. So it is that every upset is a setup for personal growth. And so for you, the listener, you are probably triggered and upset all of the time. And you probably look at the person who's triggering and upsetting you. And so every upset is a setup, is
Love
an
it.
invitation to look in the mirror. How does that feel? What am I thinking? What is my behavior? What do I want to do differently? And that little every upset is a setup can help you begin to do this work each time. And of course, it's fertile ground for doing it with the relationships we're talking about.
And then I would add, every upset is a setup to write the better story for you and the people you love the most. You don't have to be a part of this codependent story with a narcissist and have this sad story of what happened, but you could have the setup for new stories and new memories of what you are doing that are bringing happiness to yourself and the children that you love so much. So thank you for that. That's a winner. That's a keeper. I might actually use that. Thank you.
You're welcome.
So tell us how people can get a hold of you.
Well, since you're podcasters, Journey Beyond Divorce podcast is a great way to learn a little bit more about us. jbddivorcesupport.com is our website with all of the different services that we offer. And for your audience, I would like to offer a free, what I call a rapid relief call. It's a 1-hour coaching session with me or anybody on my team to help you get clear on something that you're struggling with and in action so that you begin to move forward. It's rapidreliefcall.com and it's free. So pick a time and let us support you.
Can I get a rapid relief call every so often?
Anytime you want.
I love it. You are so good. Not only you come up with really great ways of saying talking about your services, but that one's catchy. So in conclusion, check out Karen's website, check out her programs, and I trust and endorse her, and she is going to help you should you seek her help. Karen, let's talk about the next time. Let's do this again, because I'm sure people are going to really enjoy this as much as I've enjoyed it.
Me too. Thank you, Ross.
You take care. Bye-bye.